Hello, good evening. Is there anybody? Is there anybody present in this virtual class at 7 o'clock? Yeah, Ria Barmon is watching. Good evening. Good evening. Am I audible? Am I audible? Please answer me if there is any problem with the sound. I think there is no problem with the sound. So, please respond. Then I'm starting. Hi. So, we are about to start. Please tell me one thing, whether I am audible or not, or if there is any problem with the sound. Okay. Thanks a lot, Arina Padro. Now, in the last class, that was in our classroom, we discussed imagination, primary imagination and secondary imagination, and also Coleridge's idea about fancy and imagination. Now, we will move on to chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, where Coleridge is discussing about the nature of poetry. And hello, there was a problem in the line. Okay, so in chapter 14, Coleridge is discussing the nature and function of poetry in the context of his idea of imagination and fancy, and as well as primary imagination and secondary imagination. Now, we all know that Coleridge came in contact to Wordsworth in 1796, and he published, both of them jointly published the lyrical ballads in 1798, where they propounded their own idea of literary theory and their idea about poetry and the poetic creation. But later, Wordsworth and Coleridge departed in their ideas, and Coleridge made critical comments, and he critically judged Wordsworth's idea of poetry and the functions of imagination, and he gave his own idea about imagination, the nature and function of imagination. Now, before discussing what was Coleridge's basic idea about poetry, we need to know the points where Coleridge and Wordsworth actually departed in their ideas. Now, according to Wordsworth was more interested on the impact of imagination, what exactly imagination has, or what is imagination doing in poetry. And there Wordsworth was much more vague in his concept, and he was not in the position to distinguish between fancy and imagination. To Wordsworth, imagination and fancy were almost synonymous. And Wordsworth also made no distinction between primary and secondary imagination. But Coleridge, while discussing the ideas, what is his theory of poetic creation and his literary criticism of poetry, he focused more on the nature of imagination, and he examined the role of imagination in creative activity. This is where actually Coleridge paved a new way in the context of romantic criticism, that he was more interested on exploring the nature and function of imagination. This is something very unique in the context of Coleridge's literary theory. Now, Coleridge dealt with his idea, his concept of literary creation in his chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, and there he posed a number of questions function of poetry, and he was actually examining the ways in which poetry actually differs from other artistic activities. So there are many other forms of artistic productions or artistic activities like painting, writing novels, plays, or many other things, photography itself. But how poetry is essentially different from other creative. What is exactly the role of imagination in the creative activity? Now, Coleridge actually begins by emphasizing the difference between prose and poetry. What is prose and what is poetry? Now, we see that in prose and poetry, the medium is almost is the same. That is word. So in poetry and prose, we find that words are the medium of expression. So there is basically no difference between poetry and prose in the context of words, in the context of medium. But where lies the difference? The difference lies in the combination of the contents. The words that are used in poetry and the words that are used in prose, there is a sort of difference in the use and combination of the words, as well as the objective is also different. So when I'm trying to write a poetry, I'm using words, but my objective is different, my purpose is different, and that's why I'm combining the contents, combining the things with which I'm writing poetry, that is different from the same things with which I am writing a prose. So there lies the difference. So the difference between poetry and prose, according to Coleridge, consists in combination of the words and in consequence of a different object being proposed. So the object that is there in poetry and the object that is there in prose, they are different. But the medium, the things, the units are same. They are words, but they are combined with a different objective in poetry and combined with a different objective in prose. A poem combines words differently. Why? Because it seeks to do something different. A prose combines words differently because it seeks to do something different than that of prose. Now, some people may say that if I take up a prose and I put some rhyme and rhythm and meter in that prose, so the prose will look like poetry. That is a very general conception, that if I'm taking up a prose and I'm using meter, rhyme and rhythm in that prose, then that prose will become poetry. That is in the general sense. Yes, that will become a poetry. That may become a poetry because there is rhyme in the general sense. And that sometimes helps us to memorize the thing. Because when I'm adding meter and rhyme in a prose work, there is a recurrence of certain things, a recurrence of certain ideas, which helps us to remember the thing, to memorize the thing, because it gives us a sort of pleasure. And if I go back to the basic ideas of association in psychology, we can pick up the idea that in associationist psychology and in the later ideas of the German philosophers, they said that we want to memorize those things, we try to remember those things which gives us pleasure. So if I add some rhyme and meter in a prose work, that may look like a poetry. And these rhyming tags, there will be some recurring sounds, some recurring meters and some sound qualities which yield a sort of particular pleasure. But that pleasure is not of high order. But it helps us to memorize. It helps us to remember. Now, if one wants to call it a poem, that may be a poem, but logically, that is not a poem according to Coleridge. Why? Because though there are rhyming tags and they may have some charm because of the presence of meter and rhyme, but here, in case of prose, where we have added rhyme and meter, this addition is a sort of super addition. It is super added to that work, that prose work. So it is not very much intricately related with the very nature of the prose work, of the very nature of the work. It has been super added. Now, here Coleridge is taking the term super added from Wordsworth's idea, and he ironically uses that he says that if meter and rhyme is added to it, it is something extraneous, and it is added to a prose work. What happens? It becomes a sort of extra to that work, and it is not very much intricately related with that particular prose work. So it is a sort of super addition, and Coleridge says that they do not arise from the nature of the content, because this has been added extraneously. It has no relation with the soul of the work. It is added extraneously for certain immediate purposes, for giving you a sort of pleasure, immediate pleasure, and it helps you to memorize. So Coleridge departs from Wordsworth's idea that super addition of meter and rhyme does not make a work poetry. Poetry is something different, and later he will show how poetry or a poetical work becomes a poetry because of certain functions of secondary imagination, which he has discussed in his previous chapters of Biographia Literaria. Now, he comes to the function of poetry. What exactly happens in poetry? Now he takes up the cue from this super addition, and he says that the superficial form, means this externalities, provide, however, no profound logical reason for distinguishing between different ways of handling language. This is very interesting. Please try to understand this. Please, just a minute. As you know, I always drink water when I take classes. Now he says that when something is superficially added, so there is no profound logical reasoning. It is not something which is logically combined or associated with the thing. It has been done with certain objectives. I'm adding meter or rhyme to a prose work. Why? To make people remember it. It will help people to memorize that. He says a difference of object and content supplies an additional ground of distinction. He says that where lies the distinction? The distinction between two works of art, two forms of art, it lies on the difference of objects. The objects which actually constitute, don't confuse it with the medium. Medium is the word. I'm talking of object. Object means the inherent thing which makes the thing a thing. That is an object. The difference of object and content. Content means thing which has been dealt with in a work. These things supplies an additional ground of distinction. So actually the objects and contents that distinguishes two works of art. Now, a philosopher, suppose a philosopher will seek to, he wants to differentiate between two ways of handling language. Now, when I'm dealing with a prose, I'm handling language differently compared to when I'm handling language in the case of writing poetry. So a philosopher, suppose a philosopher, he is taking up two ways of handling language by asking what each seeks to achieve. Suppose I am handling language in a way in case of prose, and I'm handling language in a way in case of poetry. In prose, suppose take it as A, and in poetry take it as B. Now, for this, when I'm differentiating the language of poetry and the language of prose, suppose a philosopher takes up this thing and he will ask for differentiation, what each of this handling seeks to achieve. What is the ultimate aim, the ultimate goal of handling language in a certain way in case of A, and handling language in a certain case in case of B? What it seeks to achieve and what it wants to do, and how that aim, the aim, helps to determine its nature. I'm handling language in a different way to do something, to writing poetry. How I'm doing that, how I'm handling the language, and how my way of I want to arrive at a certain. When I'm arriving at. Sorry, there was a disruption. I'm back. Now, these are disturbance. So, the communication truth might in turn yield a deep pleasure. Suppose my objective is to communicate truth. Now, my intention, my objective also give you pleasure. Suppose I'm reading and I'm at a certain truth. This process of arriving at truth may help me to derive some pleasure out of that. Please repeat the handling of language. Okay. Now, I was talking of the handling of language. Now, Coleridge says that regarding superficially adding rhyme and meter to a work of art, what happens? Logical reasoning behind that. There, actually, when I am adding something extraneous to it, it is something ornamental. That is not needed. That is not necessary. But I am adding that for certain purpose. So there is no profound logical reasoning behind that. And he says that and contents, there are different objects and content. Suppose in a work of prose, different objects and contents in a work of poetry. This difference in objects and contents supplies an additional ground of distinction. So, first I said that the medium is the same, but the combination of that makes a sort of difference in prose and poetry. I'm adding something to it, that not only the combination of the medium, the difference in combination, but also the difference of objects and the contents. Contents mean the thing, not the medium, the thing, which is there, which is the very theme, the very central idea of a poetry or a prose. That supplies an additional. Okay. Now the network is fine. Okay. Now this difference of object and content supplies an additional ground of distinction. The difference in the medium, difference in object, and difference in content, both these three actually differentiates a prose work from a poetry work. Now, he says that a philosopher will seek to differentiate between the two ways of handling language. Now, a philosopher is, suppose he is dealing with the nature and the function of poetry and that of prose. Now, he will do what? He will do what? That the philosopher will concentrate on the handling of language. How he will handle the language. Suppose my language when I am writing prose is different always from the language when I'm writing poetry. And while doing so, he says that he may differentiate between two ways of handling language by what? By asking what each way of handling seeks to achieve. What exactly I'm handling language in a certain way in a poem, in a poetry, or in a prose. The philosopher will try to find out what I am trying to achieve or where I am trying to arrive at. This is the first question. And the second question is, as I am using this particular way of handling language, how it determines my nature, determines the nature of the work which I'm trying to write. So this difference in the handling of language actually helps to find out the nature of the work which I am trying to write, as well as it tries to find out the very objective. I am following a particular path with specific objective, and at the same time I'm trying to understand how my aim of arriving, my objective of arriving at a specific goal helps me or helps the readers to understand the very nature of the work. That is the thing. Now is it okay? Now is it okay? Okay. Now the philosopher will say that the image is what should be the ultimate aim of poetry. Is it to arrive at my immediate aim, and what will be my ultimate end? Now, similarly, if the immediate aim be the communication of pleasure, suppose I am writing a poetry. Why? Because my immediate aim is to give my readers pleasure. Suppose this is taken. I am writing a poetry with the... I'm back. Is it okay? Is it okay? Fine. Now the connection is back. Now he says that if the immediate aim be the communication of pleasure, my immediate aim is to communicate pleasure. Now, my immediate aim is to communicate pleasure, nevertheless, truth may be the ultimate end. Because it is a belief that comes down to centuries, down the ages, that where there is no ultimate truth, there cannot be any pleasure. Or true pleasure is that pleasure which helps you to arrive at the ultimate truth. Are you there? Are you there? Now should I continue? Hello? Okay. Thank you. Now, he says that if the immediate aim be the communication of pleasure, nevertheless, truth will be the ultimate aim, or truth might be the ultimate end. Why? Because in an ideal society, nothing that was not truth, if there is no truth in it, that cannot give you pleasure. So, there is a sort of relationship between pleasure and truth. Before that, there was the problem there was the problem that we used to think that pleasure or truth belongs to two binaries. If there is pleasure, they may not arrive at a truth, or if there is truth, there may not be pleasure. But the thing is, where there is truth, that truth pleasure. Okay. Now, in society has existed, a literary work might communicate pleasure without, that is not possible, without having any concern with truth, either moral or intellectual. So there is a sort of connection between truth and pleasure. But Coleridge says that the ultimate aim, the immediate aim of poetry is to find pleasure, is to give the readers pleasure. And if there is pleasure, if the readers get certain type of pleasure, then they will be able to arrive at truth. So, giving sole importance on truth or pleasure, that is not required. So, the immediate aim of the poet should be to give the readers, if they get pleasure, they will have the taste of truth, or they will arrive of truth. So, Coleridge says the proper kinds of distinction between different kinds of writing, the proper kinds of distinction between kinds of writing can thus be most logically discussed in terms of the immediate aim or function of that. We should give more stress on the immediate aim of a poetry, not the ultimate aim, because if I can arrive at the immediate aim, that immediate aim will help me to arrive at the ultimate aim. And Coleridge says that as a poet, the poet's immediate aim should be to give pleasure to the readers. And if the poet is successful in giving pleasure to the readers will be able to arrive at truth. So Coleridge gives maximum importance on the immediate end of poetry, or the immediate aim of poetry, that is pleasure. Now, he moves on and rhyme, importance on meter, and says that something which is super added to poetry. If something is super added to poetry, either that is not meter or poetry. A poetry becomes a poetry because of meter and rhyming, which are very much intricately related with the very content of the poem. So he says that there is a sort of organic unity between the meter and rhyme. Of pleasure, he says, may be the immediate object of a work. Metrically composed. He is here confusing again. He starts confusing because Coleridge is confused. He says that in the previous discussion, he says that in the previous section, he said that the immediate aim of poetry is to. Now he says that there can be certain works where we will find that the aim of that work is to give pleasure to the readers. But that work is not metrically composed. That work is not metrically composed. Suppose I am taking up the example of a novel. Coleridge also takes up the idea of a novel. And he says that a novel, there is no meter and rhyme in novel generally. But that novel gives the readers certain sort of pleasure. Okay. Now he says that do we make these into poems? Now, because novel gives you pleasure, or reading novel makes you happy, but there is no metrical items in a novel. But if I try to add meter and rhyme in novel, what will happen? That will be in super addition. That is not needed. The novel gives you pleasure because it has certain elements in it, but the treatment is very much different from that of poetry. He says, do we make these into poems simply by superadding meter with or without rhyme? Can I add certain rhyme and meter in novel? To which Coleridge poses this question, and then he gives the answer. You cannot derive truth. Just note it down, this particular line. He says, you cannot derive truth and permanent pleasure out of any feature of a work. I repeat, you cannot derive true permanent pleasure out of any feature of a work which does not arise naturally from the total nature of that work. This is a line, Zahara, I am just quoting a line. So he says that, I repeat, you cannot derive truth and permanent pleasure. He was the ultimate end and pleasure as the immediate end, and then he says that you cannot derive truth and permanent pleasure out of any feature of a work. You cannot do that which does not arise naturally from the total nature of that work. So he says, if something is super added to something, won't give you pleasure, and that won't help you to arrive at truth. If something is extraneously added, if something is super added to any work, that won't help you to as truth from it. Here he says, to super add meter is to provide something decorative on a work of art. I'm super adding meter. It is not exactly needed or required in that work, but I'm super adding it. It is not required. Then that work of art, that literary production won't give you pleasure as well as won't help you to arrive at truth. Why? Nothing can permanently please. I'm again quoting from Coleridge's line. Jahara, this is from Biographia Literaria, chapter 14. Okay. So he says, nothing can permanently please which does not contain in itself the reason why it is. So he says that if I add something to a particular thing, if I'm adding, suppose I'm adding rhyme and meter into any work of art where it is not exactly logically required, you won't be able to get pleasure as well as arrive at truth from that work of art, which does not contain in itself the reason why it is so. It should be added where there is a reason that it should be there. It is very much required over there. Then it will help you to derive pleasure and truth out of that addition. I repeat, nothing can permanently please. Nothing can permanently please which does not contain in itself the reason why it is so. Some sort of philosophy, there are certain nooks and complications in it. Now he says that if something is added to where that addition is not logically required, you are adding because you want to add that. You are adding is as an ornament, as an extra to it. Then that addition won't give you pleasure, to arrive at truth. Only that addition, only that involvement, only that association will give you pleasure as well as help you to arrive at certain truth, where that addition, that association is logically required and there are no other ways. You need to add that. You need to associate that. Why it is not so and not otherwise? If meter, or I have repeated the line. If meter be superadded, suppose I am adding meter to any work of art, all other parts must be made consonant with it. Consonant means, con means associated, one which is related. Sona means, son means sound. So it should be soundly, just one sound is associated with another sound, and if the association is perfect, it makes melody. Otherwise it makes symphony. Otherwise, if particular sound is associated with another sound and there is no combination, there is no compatibility, there will be cacophony, not symphony. Rudrajit will better understand this. Rudrajit, say something. When symphony happens and when there is a cacophony. Okay. You want to answer. Okay, if meter be super added, suppose I'm adding meter into a work of art. If that is a super addition, what will happen? There will be the lack of compatibility in that line. Okay, if meter is super added to any work of art, there will be a sort of incompatibility. And pleasure only comes from compatibility. When the content of the work of art actually logically requires that addition, then only that work of art will give you pleasure and help you to arrive at truth. Rhyme and meter involve what? Now what happens when I add rhyme and meter to any work of art? And rhyme and meter involves what? What do they involve? An exact correspondent recurrence of accents and sounds. Suppose I am rhyming. What is happening? There will be a recurrence of sounds. The last syllable will rhyme with the last syllable of the second line, or the last syllable of alternate rhymes, or the last two syllables will rhyme with one another, or something. So what will happen? There will be a recurrence of accents and sounds, which in turn are calculated. So they are very much measured, calculated. They are arranged in such a proper synchronization that it gives perpetual and distinct attention to each part. Suppose I am mixing something with another thing. Suppose I am taking a glass of water. Okay, I am taking a glass of water and I put a spoon of sugar into that glass of water. Until and unless I stir it properly and the sugar gets completely mixed up with that water, you won't get a glass of syrup. You won't get a glass of sweet liquid or a fluid. What will happen if the stirring is not proper? The sugar will get precipitated at the end of that, the bottom of the glass. Okay. Now what happens here? Here the addition is not proper. It is now I add a spoonful of sugar into a glass, and I added, the sugar got mixed. I added one more spoon. That also got melted into the water and increasing the sweetness of the water. I added more and more and more. And after some time I will see that the water cannot absorb the sugar. The sugar is getting precipitated at the bottom of the glass. So what will happen? That will be something added, super added, extraneous. So that actually disturbs the very nature of the glass full of sweet water or the glass full of sharbat. So this is the thing. So when the addition is proper and when the addition is done in properly following the logical requirement, what will happen? The addition will help to do what? Distinctively it will add and enhance each and every part of that work of art. So if the sugar is properly melted, absorbed in the glass of water, the whole glass full of water will become sweet and there will be no precipitation. There you won't find any sugar lying at the bottom of the glass. Because if you find sugar lying at the bottom of the glass, that is extra, that is super added. Okay. Which line, Arina? Which line? Okay. I repeat. Now what happens? Rhyme and meter involve an exact correspondent recurrence of accents and sounds that I said. There is a recurrence of accents and sounds in a rhyme and meter. Now when I am adding this rhyme and meter into a work of art, what happens? This calculated thing. So rhyme and meter means what? It is very much measured, calculated, synchronized, everything proper. That's why it is a rhyme and meter. There is symphony. Otherwise it would have become cacophony. So this calculated thing, it excites. It do what? It excites. So when I'm melting, when I'm adding the full of sugar in a glass of water, I'm exciting the glass of water. And after some time what happens? The sugar gets completely absorbed in the glass of water and the water changes. The nature of the water changes. It becomes sweet. Now, if that mixing is not proper or there is some extra thing mixed into that water, what will happen? If the mixing is not proper, you won't find the water sweet in all respect, properly, perfectly sweet, or it is over sweet and there will be precipitation at the end, which is extra. So, Coleridge wants to point out to the fact that when meter or rhyme is perfectly logically added to any work of art, to any literary production, what happens? If that mixing, if that association follows the required logic, what will happen? It will perpetuate a sort of excitement and it will change the very distinctively different part of that work of art. Each and every part of that work of art, it will get enriched. It will change. That the quality, the nature will be enhanced. Now, this is the point that when rhyme and meter is not super added, but added following the logical requirement and organically added, where it is added where it is logically required, then that addition or then that involvement, then that association helps to enhance the very quality of that work of art. Is it clear? Fine. A poem, so he says, a poem therefore must be an organic unity. He says that a poem is an complete body. So a body becomes a body because a body is a combination of this head, this face, these two hands, fingers, this body, this legs, and each and every part. So if I cut out one hand, this body will become incomplete. So each and every part helps to construct this body, and the body also gives meaning and validation to each and every part of this body. This hand becomes my right hand because it is on the right hand side of my body. This ear becomes my right ear because it is there on the right hand side of my body. This is my right eye because it is on the right side of my face. Okay, so organic unity of a poem means each and every component of the poem helps to make the poem a poem, and the poem itself validates, gives meaning to each and every componential part which completes the body. So rhyme and meter, if they are super added, they are not organically associated with the poem. But when they are added following a logical requirement, then only that rhyme and meter helps to enhance the quality or helps to enrich the very literary work. So something which is super added to anything is not something properly added. If rhyme and meter is super added to any work of art, I'm adding rhyme and meter to a prose and that becomes a poetry, that is not true poetry according to Cole. And meter is added following the logic, and meter is and meter which helps to make that literary work a proper poetical production. Is it okay? Now, to which the regular, so thus he says that a poem differs from a work of scientific prose in having as its immediate object. So in scientific work we see what we have discussed earlier, or may write a piece of history or a philosophical treatise or a scientific writing, anything, his immediate object is what? To give certain ideas of truth. And that particular idea of truth, or which helps you to arrive at certain truth, will give you pleasure. But Coleridge says the function and nature of poetry is completely different from that of philosophy or science or history, in the sense that its immediate objective is not truth but pleasure. But nevertheless, that getting pleasure helps the readers at okay. It differs from other kinds of writing which have pleasure and not truth as the immediate object. So this and this. So, and then he says that in a poem the pleasure we get because the whole work is compatible with or even led up to by pleasure we take in each component part. He says that the two things Coleridge here actually wants to focus on, or he gives more stress on that. One is the immediate end of the immediate aim of poetry is to give the readers pleasure, and that pleasure ultimately helps the readers to arrive at certain truth. One, and the readers can only get pleasure from any poetical work when all the components, the medium of the poem, that is the word, the content, the form, the structuration, the stanza division, as well as the rhyme and meter, all these are organically associated, assembled into that poem, so much so that there is a sort of organic unity. Is there any buffering? Now it is okay. So he says that all the componential parts which make up the poem, all these componential parts create a sort of organic unity. And this organic unity means what? All the componential part gives meaning to the poem, and the poem as a whole gives meaning as well as validation to all the componential parts. This scientific logical reasoning actually that is there in a true poem, that is what Coleridge wants to point out, a true poem which actually gives the readers pleasure. Is it okay? Now, Coleridge here, just you can note it down, this line. This is from Biographia Literaria, chapter 14. So, according to Coleridge, a legitimate poem is a composition. He says, legitimate poem. A legitimate poem is a composition in which the rhyme and meter. So, can you follow me? A legitimate poem is a composition in which the rhyme and meter bear an organic relation to the total work. He says a legitimate poem is a composition in which the rhyme and meter bear an organic relation to the total work. So there will be an organic relation. And he says in it, the parts, all the componential parts, mutually support and explain each other. He says that all the componential parts, suppose there are A, B, C, D, 4 componential parts, they are mutually supporting and explaining each other. They are validating each other. They are giving meaning to each other mutually. So they do what? The parts mutually support and explain each other, all in their proportion. So they are very much proportionate, harmonizing with and supporting the purpose. I will repeat, Manisha, I will repeat. Harmonizing with and supporting the purpose and known influences of metrical arrangement. This particular line you will get in the text. The part composition in which the rhyme and the bear an organic relation to the total work. In which the rhyme and meter bear an organic relation to the total work. In it, which will explain each other, all in their proportion, harmonizing, supporting. So they have a single purpose, they have a single aim. And what is that aim? And studied in our last semester in Apology for Poetry. I'm back. Am I audible now? Can you get me? Hello? Oh my God. Is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay, Manisha. Now Coleridge puts an end to the age-old controversy. What should be the end of poetry? Is it instruction or delight? He says that its aim is definitely to give pleasure. So this is the thing that the romantic critics tried to establish. That is what? That ultimate aim is definitely to give pleasure. The aim of poetry is to give pleasure. And further, poetry has its own distinctive pleasure. So the aim of any work of art is to give pleasure, and poetry has its own distinctive pleasure. And what is that pleasure? So poetry gives you a different sort of pleasure. And what is that pleasure? Pleasure arising. So poetry gives you the pleasure. Oh God. Can you see me? Now Is it okay now? Is it okay? Okay. Oh, distinctive pleasure. Fine. Now see, so I'm talking of that Coleridge makes an end to the age-old controversy between the aim and objective of poetry, and what is that. Okay, I'll repeat. So he says that Coleridge makes an end to the age-old controversy between the aim and objective of poetry. That what is the aim and objective of poetry? Is it only to give instruction or to pleasure or both? I'm repeating. Means that pleasure arises from the parts, from the componential parts, and this pleasure of the parts supports and increases the pleasure of the whole. So as I said, that there should be an organic unity in a true poem, in a legitimate poem according to Coleridge. That the organic unity means the componential parts will give pleasure to the readers, and that pleasure so that pleasure which arises from the parts, from the componential parts, actually supports and increases the pleasure of the whole. Now what I say as the pleasure that we derive from poetry is actually an unbroken pleasure trip from the parts to the whole. So an unbroken pleasure trip. So don't think that because there are components, various parts, so the pleasure is not actually a broken pleasure. This componential parts gives you pleasure, and that particular pleasure actually helps you to get more pleasure from the whole work. So actually the pleasure that we get from poetry is a sort of pleasure trip which is unbroken, which moves from the part to the whole. Is it okay now?